Hi, my name is Frida Splendido and I'm one of the coordinators for the LAMiNATE research platform. In January of 2022, LAMiNATE held its first research conference. It was a two-day event with presentations on language acquisition, multilingualism and language teaching. One of the keynotes was Professor Pint Li, who's Chair Professor of Neurolinguistics and Bilingual Studies, as well as Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. His keynote had the title Digital Language Learning, Insights from Behaviour, Cognition and the Brain. I had the opportunity to talk to Professor Pint Li about the future of this field of research, and that is the interview that you will now see. Welcome to everyone. Today we have Professor Pint Li with us, who is here to answer a few questions about his field of research and what might be the future of this field of research. So thank you so much for doing this. And I would just like to start off. Could you say something about your research interests? How would you describe them? What are your main keywords, so to speak?
Yeah, my research really covers a lot of different areas that are all connected to language. So I was trained as a psycholinguist, but my interests have shifted over the years from studying children to studying adults, to looking at computational models, and looking into neurocognitive brain changes. So in terms of both the population and the methods and the kinds of issues that I try to address, they actually cover quite a range of topics. But the key thing is language. How is language acquired by kids? How are languages acquired by adults? There are different second languages. And how does the brain process information with regard to language, representation of language? So it's all related to language. So broadly speaking, I'm a language scientist using a variety of methodologies and approaches. So it covers both child language and the bilingual adult language, learning and representation. So broadly speaking.
Mm-hmm. And what got you interested in this? How did you end up in this field? Has that always been an interest of yours?
Yeah, it's when I did my graduate study in China originally. I was actually studying historical changes in Chinese ancient texts. So that that didn't really stay with me for too long. And then there was an opportunity actually for me to go to the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands. And that's really what drove me to my current inquiries today, that I described just now in terms of understanding language learning, language representation in children, in adults, and even in computational systems, how we can model these processes. So I think all of my colleagues in the field would know about the exciting work going on at the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen. And my research interest really took off there in terms of, what kinds of issues I want to study, what kind of issues get me excited every morning. And I have really fond memories of my time in the Netherlands at the Max Planck Institute, and still I'm even to this day I still have really close both personal and research relationships with the colleagues in there. Many colleagues are still working in the same field or the large field of language science as I do. I belong to the very first cohort of PhD students at the Max Planck Institute. So it was really a distinct honor for me to be in that cohort. Working as PhD students with people like Peter Haggard, who is still the director of Max Planck Institute, and Tom Dijkstra, and Antje Meyer. They are all still in Nijmegen. So I was one of the, I believe 6 PhD students from the initial cohort. So yeah, so I would really put Nijmegen as the starting point of my research interest into today. And then I had a chance to do a postdoc research in UC San Diego in the Center for Language Research, for Center for Research in Language. And there again, I was able to pick up a lot of the new computational approaches, neuroscience approaches to language in both children and adults. So really my early careers and my experiences in doing the PhD and in doing the postdoc fellowships, they drove me to my current interest.
And could you say something about one of the projects that you have going on right now? What's something that you're working on right now as an illustration of these?
One of the projects that really got me excited, or it still gets me excited every morning, is the one that I talked about at the Lund LAMiNATE Conference, the digital language learning, and specifically using virtual reality and digital medium to study how best we can understand people's second language learning, but also how we might at least to some extent help people to learn a second language better. So from a theoretical point of view, we want to understand how young people, especially today, are using digital platforms and digital tools for learning a new language. In a very recent survey we did ourselves in Hong Kong, over 70% of our students are already using the commercially available software, such as Babbel and Rosetta Stone, to learn foreign languages, mostly in Hong Kong, of course, learning English. According to some surveys, some other large-scale surveys out there, it seems especially young children or young people, their digital world has become their real world. Half of the time they are spending doing internet-related things, and some of them maybe even using their phones day in, day out for 8 hours a day. So I think we need to understand how the digital tools and the platforms are really with the young people, and how they use the digital forms to learn language. So this is one of my major projects, which I talked about during the talk in the LAMiNATE conference. Yeah.
So that still ties in, if I understand you correctly, the long-term goals of the research that you do is understanding how people learn languages and how we can best support language learners in their acquisition. And right now that is within the digital realm, what's going on and how can that be manipulated, so to speak, or enhanced to further help the language acquisition.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. I mean, the interesting story about digital platform is although it's pervasive today, it's more recent. In the let's say going back 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we don't have youngsters using iPhones all day, but digital media has been with us. The internet has been there for 40 years, or 35 years. I remember when I was forced to begin my graduate study, my PhD study at the Max Planck, we were so excited to have the internet in the late 80s. But today the landscape has really changed. So but it's going so quickly and the technology develops so rapidly. Now many of the companies that are developing these tools and technology, they may not really directly understand how people learn. They are very good at developing tools and products and the commercial software that they claim can help people, but they don't really understand how people learn. And that's really what researchers like us do. We try to understand what is really going on in the process, in the minds and the brains of the people who are learning, in this case, learning language. We need to understand how they, at the different ages and different levels, different degrees of engagement, how they really acquire the language, and in which form they are actually so-called representing the newly acquired language. How does that differ from the native language? And how does the native language get in the way to either interfere or help them to learn the new language? And all of those issues belong to the researchers. Many times the industry, either they have no interest in this or they really don't understand it. So it really requires a close interaction for the future, maybe, between the researchers and the industry, the software designers and the tool developers. So I think that's another sort of a avenue and the domain where I see great potential and promise for young junior researchers to think about how we can best combine theory and practice to leverage what we learn from academia, from the research, with the tools and the technologies available or to be developed by the industry.
Yeah, and really make that available to the public that way.
Exactly. And further extend the horizon of language science. We do language science as a science, as a domain of academia. But I think there's a really great potential there for, traditionally, as I did, looking at how children learn languages, how adults learn a foreign language. We have a lot of knowledge about how people learn and how they use their minds and brains to process information. But that information and that knowledge now can be transferred and translated into practice to develop better pedagogies and curriculum designs and tools to help people. I think this domain holds a lot of promise for people both interested in the theory of language, but also interested in the practice of helping people to learn language.
Indeed. What would you say so you talked about how this started at Max Planck, how that was really the time that got you started in the field and looking up until now. What would you say is your most significant finding so far?
Yeah, I'm really interested in how people are different from one another when they learn a new language, either in the kids, in first language or in second language. So the so-called individual differences, I mean, it's a big topic by a lot of, with a lot of psychologists and linguists. So I try to understand how people are different and what are driving these differences. Is it the age at which you start to learn language that makes the impact, and how we actually character the underlying forces and mechanisms underlying the so-called age effect. So I've built a number of models to simulate the mechanisms or the factors the principles that can drive such differences. So in modeling, we found important factors that may come into play across the trajectory of learning, could affect how well you both learn the language and how well you represent the language, and how the two languages you have acquired, along the course might so-called interact with each other. So this is one of the things that really interests me in terms of the dynamics of interaction between the two languages. So I try to see the individual differences in this domain and how such differences might actually be modulated by in the cognitive capacity, such as working memory, everybody comes to the language learning task with the different capacities or aptitude, how those might actually affect the dynamics of how two languages interact. And the other thing that I feel really sort of proud of the kind of work that I do is I wanted to see how, in terms of the actual brain, how individual differences as we see in brain neural correlates, how these might relate to somebody's learning progress or success. So in one study, for example, we identified people's brain structure or brain function networks before they started to learn a second language, in this case, Chinese. And then we compare with the brain networks after they have learned or have been trained to learn Chinese for a number of weeks, and we found out, interestingly, we could make some predictions by just looking at what the brain networks are before they're learning, and then predict how well they might end up learning Chinese as a second language. So that has implications for understanding individual differences. Maybe the way your brain is, let's say, configured in some way. For example, some people are very good at detecting different minute tonal differences, intonations and perceptual acuity. These so-called acoustic and phonological processing abilities. And these might actually allow people to learn a language such as Chinese better, because Chinese relies a lot on phonological and tonal differences in order to differentiate lexical items. So lexical tones are very important. If you are not good at distinguishing tones, you might be somewhat, let's say, if not doomed, but less successful at learning a language like Chinese. So, studying individual differences using this neural-based approach to individual difference might help us to understand why some people are having more difficulty as compared with somebody sitting next to them in the same classroom, spending the same amount of time, end up with the different products when it comes to learning a second language. So I think these approaches are helpful for us in understanding people's differences in learning a second language. Really going back to my interest in understanding how come we see such huge differences given the same amount of time, resources, and the target of language learning. So I think the newer methodologies and the approaches really enable us to do a much better job than we could in the past.
Fascinating. Very interesting work. To round things off with the $1 million question, how would you, so you've talked a bit about what's ahead and finding ways of building bridges between research and the industry and finding ways to make them work for each other, so to speak, for the learners. How would you assess the current state of this field, of the research field that you're in? And what would you say are the central questions, apart from this bridging between business and research? What would you say are the central questions for the 10, 15 years ahead? So where are we at and where do we need to be going?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned I'm really excited about the future direction in the field, for people who are studying language science, particularly because language science is no longer just linguistics. I think many of my colleagues make it very clear that we no longer call ourselves linguists as such. We are language scientists. And that really is a big change in terms of how we perceive our field. in the degree to which our science or our domain of inquiry has become as interdisciplinary as it can be in other fields, in other domains of inquiry. So in order to understand language learning, language representation, we can no longer just rely on the traditional methods of self-introspection, or just come up with a few good sentences to analyze them, or even in the method that Chomsky used to study the structures of languages. I think those approaches, there's a more narrow fields of inquiry in linguistics as defined by Chomsky, for example, do not characterize today's language science or characterize what language scientists do. They, on the one hand, I mean, my example early on in terms of the collaboration between understanding learners' individual differences and the collaboration between academia and the industry is just one example. But language sciences really now branch out to many domains. Let's take the hardest field, if you will, AI, artificial intelligence. As a matter of fact, the most rapid advances in AI have to do with language. For example, there are systems that can automatically produce not just the sentences, but whole paragraphs, sometimes indistinguishable from a human speaker. So if you give a topic to an AI system, it can produce the whole text for you about this topic. For example, if you say humans live in Mars, the AI system can produce an entire paragraph that sometimes can be indistinguishable from a human speaker. So AI systems really relied a lot today on advances in language studies. Natural language processing is one of the most promising AI development, the fields in AI, and the developments in NLP really gets people in AI very excited. So language science is really very interdisciplinary today, and it branches out to things like AI, to technology, of course, to education. We try to find the best way we can teach second languages, as I mentioned earlier. It also branches out to neuroscience, to the study of brain, neuroplasticity. So it's very exciting when we consider language studies and language science in this broader context. So in the next 10 to 15 years, I imagine we will see further new breakthroughs in not just using the technology for understanding how we learn language, but also in really understand what it is that we humans can talk, can learn to speak, and that actually provides additional insights and information to other fields. I think it's an interaction both ways. It's not just we use the technology and the methodology and the approaches from other fields to study language. Vice versa, what we've gained from our fields as language scientists, as somebody interested in learning and acquisition of language, it can really feed back to those AI researchers, to the neuroscientists, to the computational researchers, and to the industry. So I think the two-way interaction between us as researchers, as scientists, and them as the software developers and education practitioners are both ways, and this is what's going to be really exciting.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor Pint Li.